As the 20th century approached, the United States entered the world stage as at least an equal influence to such traditional powers as Britain and France. The United States emerged from the Spanish-American War as a great world power. With new territorial acquisitions in the Asian Pacific, questions swirled in the United States about the appropriateness of American imperialism. As the United States industrialized, businessmen began to look overseas for additional markets, sources of raw materials for future developments, and potential investment. Many Americans felt that the United States should become an imperial power similar to the European nations with their colonies in Africa and Asia. Many also believed the United States should build up its naval capacity to protect national interests. The first overseas opportunity for the United States came with the acquisition of Alaska from Russia in 1867. Closer to home, the United States began to pursue interests in the Caribbean, which ultimately led the nation into a war against Spain. For a long time, the United States had an interest in Cuba. Throughout the 19th century, the Cubans had tried to overthrow Spanish rule, but had been met with defeat each time. In 1895, a new revolution broke out. Spain responded with great force and brutality. Angered over the harsh treatment of the Cubans and fearful of losses to millions of American investments in Cuba, many Americans demanded action against Spain. The United States responded by sending the battleship Maine to the shores of Cuba. On February 15, 1898, the battleship exploded and sank in Havana Harbor. The incident killed 250 officers and men on the ship. Newspapers in the United States demanded military action against what was perceived as an act of war. President McKinley was initially reluctant to declare war on Spain without clear evidence of Spanish involvement in the Maine's destruction. Newspaper articles written with little or no factual content, known as yellow journalism, helped to sway public opinion, and war was ultimately declared against Spain. The initial phases of the Spanish-American War actually began in the Pacific, rather than in Cuba. Since 1882, the United States Navy had undergone a modernization campaign that resulted in the creation of a two-ocean fleet. Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt positioned ships near the Philippines prior to the declaration of war. When war was declared, Roosevelt ordered the Navy to proceed immediately to the Philippines. The U.S. Navy surprised the anchored Spanish ships and destroyed them. After the naval operation, the United States moved quickly to bring land forces to the Philippines. After victories over the Spanish in Cuba and Puerto Rico, the 1898 Treaty of Paris ended the war. Under the provisions, Spain agreed to grant Cuba independence. The final provision granted the United States acquisition of the Caribbean island of Puerto Rico, the Pacific island of Guam, and the Philippines for $20 million. Americans debated whether the United States should expand its territory to include the Philippines or respect Filipino independence. The United States decided to administer the islands as a territory because officials were afraid a free and independent Philippines would be a weak nation vulnerable to foreign takeover. Angered by the United States' decision, Filipino freedom fighters under the leadership of Emilio Aguinaldo continued their fight. This time, the fight was against the United States in what is known as the Philippine-American War. By 1902, the guerrilla forces were defeated, and the United States began administration of the islands, gradually releasing control until final independence of the Philippines occurred in 1946. The United States Congress had debated and rejected the annexation of Hawaii many times since 1893, when a group of American businessmen led a rebellion against the Hawaiian monarch and petitioned to become part of the United States. The prize naval base at Pearl Harbor had been leased by the United States for decades, and it proved to be crucial to naval operations in the Pacific during the Spanish-American War. As a result, Congress considered the value of this resource, and annexation of Hawaii was approved in 1898. The acquisition of the new territories of Hawaii, the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico prompted an intense debate over American expansionism. Many Americans opposed the annexation of the Philippines on grounds that it was the antithesis of America's founding principles. Others believed that the expansion of the United States beyond its North American boundaries was important for trade, diplomatic power, and national defense. Following the end of the Spanish-American War, the United States was in an excellent position to take advantage of markets throughout Latin America. The centerpiece of this development was the construction of a transoceanic canal between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, known as the Panama Canal. There were three basic reasons for a canal. First, the United States needed to shorten the sailing time between the east and west coast. Second, national defense officials needed to facilitate faster movement of U.S. naval assets from one ocean to another. The final reason was that the United States needed to protect its new holdings in the Pacific. Earlier attempts to build a canal in Central America by both French and U.S. companies had been failures. In 1903, following diplomatic maneuvering by the United States, the construction of the Panama Canal was attempted again. The United States had to overcome difficult terrain and tropical illnesses to build the canal. The effort was a success, and the Panama Canal opened to naval ships in 1914. To protect the canal and U.S. regional interests, Theodore Roosevelt issued what became known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, usually shortened to the Roosevelt Corollary. In 1902, Venezuela was threatened with invasion by Great Britain and Germany over the nation's inability to pay back loans to the banks of each respective nation. Roosevelt, fearing European encroachment in Latin America, reminded the Europeans that the U.S. held to the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. In 1904, Roosevelt stated that the Europeans were not welcome in the region and the U.S. would oversee the collection of any national debts owed by Latin American nations to Europeans. In essence, the U.S. would intervene in Latin American countries to prevent their takeover by any other nation. The Roosevelt Corollary became a key component of Roosevelt's Big Stick policy. President Roosevelt based his foreign policy on the idea of "speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far." Roosevelt believed that negotiations were key to any relationships. But if negotiations were not fruitful, then the United States would use its military to enforce order. Invoking the corollary, the United States intervened in the Dominican Republic in 1904, Nicaragua in 1912, and Haiti in 1915. The policy pleased businessmen in the United States and Great Britain. However, the Roosevelt Corollary angered Latin Americans, who felt that the United States did not have the right to intervene in their affairs.